October 31st, 1914. A chateau near the Belgian village of Gheluvelt. The British line had broken. German troops were pouring through the gap. Headquarters staff were burning documents, preparing to evacuate. The entire Ypres salient, and with it Britain's position in the war, was about to collapse. Field Marshal Sir John French, commanding the British Expeditionary Force, watched his army disintegrate before his eyes. Then someone spotted them. 364 men of the 2nd Worcestershire Regiment, advancing through shellfire toward the chateau. A single battalion, not even at full strength, against multiple German divisions. It seemed insane. It seemed suicidal. This is the story of Gelvelt, the moment when one battalion's desperate counterattack changed the course of the First World War. The day when British stubbornness, courage, and cold steel proved stronger than overwhelming German numbers. And the battle that demonstrated what a few hundred determined men could achieve when everything hung in the balance. Welcome to Britain's history. Today we're covering the charge that saved an empire, a battle where 364 soldiers faced impossible odds and won anyway. But before we get to that desperate bayonet charge through the chateau grounds, before we watch the Worcesters restore a collapsing line through sheer courage, we need to understand the crisis that made this battle necessary. Because without knowing how close Britain came to catastrophic defeat in October 1914, you can't appreciate what those 364 men achieved. And if you're enjoying this, subscribe. We cover the moments that defined Britain, the battles against impossible odds, the victories that changed history, the days when everything hung by a thread. Let's go back to August 1914, when the First World War began, and Britain committed its small professional army, the British Expeditionary Force, to defend Belgium and France against German invasion. The BF numbered only about 100,000 men, tiny compared to the mass conscript armies of continental Europe. But these were professional soldiers, volunteers who'd chosen military life, trained to the highest standards. They were, in the Kaiser's dismissive phrase, a contemptible little army. The soldiers would later wear that insult with pride as the old contemptibles. While many modern historians now debate whether the Kaiser ever actually uttered those words, some suggesting it was a clever piece of British propaganda to stoke recruitment, the effect was the same. In August and September, the BF fought desperate rearguard actions as the German armies swept through Belgium and northern France. At Mons, Le Château, and the Marne, British soldiers demonstrated their superiority in musketry and discipline. But they were being ground down by sheer numbers. By October, the original BF was a shadow of its August strength. Units that had marched to war with 1,000 men now counted 200. Officers who'd commanded battalions were dead, wounded, or commanding what remained of brigades. The professional army Britain had spent decades building was bleeding to death in the mud of Flanders. October 1914 saw what historians call the race to the sea, both sides trying to outflank each other northward toward the English Channel. The race ended at Ypres, an ancient market town in Belgian Flanders. Ypres was strategically vital. It controlled the roads to the channel ports of Calais and Dunkirk. If Germany captured Ypres, they'd break through to the coast, cut Britain's supply lines, and possibly knock the BF out of the war entirely. Britain couldn't allow that. The BF would hold Ypres whatever the cost. The Germans understood Ypres' importance as well as the British. They assembled massive forces, fresh reserve divisions, newly trained volunteers, the best units they could spare from other fronts. The German plan was straightforward: break the British line with overwhelming force, drive through to the Channel, win the war in the West before 1915. They had the numbers, they had the artillery, they had the momentum. What they didn't know was whether the battered, exhausted British would break. The First Battle of Ypres began in mid-October 1914 and would rage for over a month. The Germans attacked repeatedly, hurling division after division against the thin British line. The BF held barely. British soldiers fought from hastily dug trenches, from hedgerows, from the ruins of farms and villages. They fired until their rifle barrels overheated and their fingers bled. They bayoneted German infantry who broke through. They died in their positions rather than retreat. The line bent, it buckled, but it didn't break. By late October, both sides were exhausted. The Germans had taken horrific casualties. Their new volunteer divisions were shattered, sometimes losing 50% of their strength in single attacks. But they'd also inflicted terrible losses on the British. The old contemptibles were being systematically destroyed. Battalions that had defended the line for weeks were down to company strength. Officers were commanding units 2 or 3 ranks above their normal station. Everyone was beyond exhaustion, running on discipline and sheer bloody-mindedness, but the line still held. October 31st, 1914. The Germans made one more massive effort. They'd identified a weak point in the British line near the village of Gheluvelt, just east of Ypres. The British 1st Division held this sector, or what remained of the division. These units had been fighting continuously since August. They were shadows of their former strength, exhausted men holding impossible positions with dwindling ammunition and collapsing morale. The Germans knew if they could break through here, the road to Ypres lay open. At dawn on October 31st, German artillery opened a devastating barrage on the Gheluvelt sector. Hundreds of guns pounded the British trenches. Then the infantry came, wave after wave of German soldiers advancing through the morning mist. The British defenders fired until they couldn't fire anymore. They fixed bayonets. They fought hand to hand in their trenches. And finally they broke. The 1st Division's line shattered. German troops poured through the gap, advancing toward Gheluvelt Château, a large manor house that served as a British headquarters and command post. If the Germans took the chateau, they'd cut the British line in 2. Everything east of Gelvelt would be isolated and destroyed. The entire Ypres salient would collapse. The channel ports would be exposed. This was the moment. This was the crisis. Everything that happened next would determine whether Britain stayed in the war. At British headquarters, staff officers watched the disaster unfold with mounting horror. Reports flooded in. The line was broken. Units were retreating in disorder. Germans were advancing on the chateau. Field Marshal French, normally unshakable, looked shaken. His chief of staff later recalled the atmosphere as one of impending catastrophe. The BEF, Britain's professional army, the force that had held the line for 3 months against impossible odds, was about to be broken. Officers began burning documents. Evacuation plans were drafted. The unthinkable was happening, but 3 miles behind the collapsing front, in Polygon Wood, one unit remained intact. The 2nd Worcestershire Regiment, the Worcesters, were in reserve. They'd been pulled from the line the previous day, given a few hours' rest, brought back up to strength with every man who could walk and carry a rifle. They numbered 364 soldiers, not a full-strength battalion, not even close, but 364 British soldiers who'd been fighting since August, who'd survived Mons and the Marne, and 3 weeks of desperate fighting at Ypres. 364 professionals who knew their trade. Major Edward Hankey commanded the Worcesters. He was 34 years old, a career officer, respected by his men for his competence and courage. When the order came, counterattack toward Gheluvelt, restore the line, hold at all costs, Hankey understood exactly what it meant. His battalion was being asked to charge into a gap that multiple divisions had failed to hold, against German forces that had just broken the British line, with no support, no reserves, no backup plan. It was a mission with one probable outcome: complete destruction of the battalion. Hankey assembled his officers. He explained the situation simply. The line was broken. The Germans were advancing. If they weren't stopped, the war might be lost. The Worcesters would advance to Gheluvelt Château, counterattack through the grounds, and drive the Germans back. Questions? There were none. These were professionals. They understood. They'd do their jobs. They'd follow their orders. They'd advance even if it killed every man in the battalion. Because that's what British soldiers did. At approximately 1 p.m, the Worcesters advanced from Polygon Wood toward Gheluvelt. They moved in extended line, bayonets fixed, officers in front. German artillery spotted them almost immediately. Shells began falling among the advancing troops. Men dropped. The line closed up and kept moving. More shells. More casualties. The battalion didn't stop. They crossed open ground, exposed to both artillery and machine gun fire, heading directly toward the chateau, where German troops were consolidating their breakthrough. The Worcesters reached the chateau grounds. They could see German soldiers in the gardens, in the outbuildings, occupying the positions the British had abandoned. This was the moment. Hankey gave the order, charge. 364 men, now perhaps 300, already reduced by the advance under fire, charged across the chateau grounds with fixed bayonets. The Germans never expected a counterattack. They'd broken the British line. They'd driven the defenders back. They were securing their positions, bringing up reinforcements, preparing to exploit the breakthrough. And suddenly, out of nowhere, British infantry were charging at them with bayonets levelled. The psychological shock was devastating. The Worcesters hit the German positions like a hammer. Bayonet fighting in the gardens. Room-to-room combat in the chateau buildings. Close-range firefights in the outbuildings. This was vicious personal combat. No artillery support, no machine guns, just British soldiers with rifles and bayonets, clearing Germans from positions they'd taken an hour earlier. The Germans fought back. Many died fighting, but the momentum was with the Worcesters. The shock of the attack, the fury of the charge, the desperation that comes from knowing this is the last throw of the dice. It overwhelmed the German defenders. Within 30 minutes, the Worcesters had retaken the chateau. They'd driven the Germans back across the grounds. They'd restored the British line at precisely the point where it had broken. The gap was sealed. The crisis was over. The Western Front was saved. But the cost was terrible. The Worcesters lost 187 men in that single charge, over 50% casualties. Major Hankey was killed days later, still fighting near Gheluvelt. Officers and men who'd survived since August died, reclaiming a chateau most had never heard of before that day, but they'd achieved something extraordinary. 364 men had counterattacked against overwhelming German forces and won. They'd restored a collapsing line, they'd saved an entire army from potential destruction, and they'd kept Britain in the war. At British headquarters, the relief was overwhelming. When news arrived that the Worcesters had retaken the chateau and sealed the line, French reportedly said, "The situation is saved." Staff officers who'd been preparing evacuation plans began planning the next day's defence. The crisis had passed. The BF would hold, Ypres would hold, Britain would stay in the war. All because 364 men charged when charging seemed suicidal, fought when fighting seemed hopeless, and won when victory seemed impossible. The First Battle of Ypres continued for another 2 weeks, but the Germans never again came as close to breaking through. The line stabilised. Trench warfare began. It would last 4 years. Ypres became a symbol of British resistance, the town where the old contemptibles stood their ground against overwhelming odds and refused to break. The salient around Ypres would see 3 more massive battles between 1914 and 1918. British and Commonwealth soldiers would die there by the hundreds of thousands, but the line would never break. The first men who held it, in October 1914, had set a standard that those who followed tried to match. The consequences of Gheluvelt extended far beyond that single day. If the Worcesters had failed, if the line had collapsed, Germany might have broken through to the Channel ports in November 1914. Britain's supply lines would have been cut. The BEF might have been forced to evacuate. France, already reeling from German advances, might have sought peace. The war could have ended in 1914, with German victory in the West. Instead, the Worcesters' charge bought time. Time for Britain to mobilise the empire, time to train new armies, time to build the industrial capacity that would eventually defeat Germany. That 30-minute charge changed the trajectory of the entire war. The Battle of Gheluvelt also demonstrated something fundamental about the British soldier in the First World War. These weren't the mass conscript armies that would fight later battles. These were professionals, volunteers, men who'd chosen military life and trained for years. They understood discipline, cohesion, the importance of following orders even under impossible circumstances. When Hankey ordered the charge, 364 men charged. They didn't debate, they didn't hesitate, they did their jobs. And that professional competence, that ingrained discipline, that willingness to follow orders into the teeth of death, that's what saved the Western Front. Military historians study Gheluvelt as a perfect example of the counterattack at the critical moment. The Germans had achieved tactical breakthrough. They'd broken the British line. They had local superiority in numbers and firepower, but they'd lost momentum. They'd stopped to consolidate. And in that brief window, the Worcesters hit them with a force that seemed to come from nowhere. The Germans hadn't expected resistance. They certainly hadn't expected a bayonet charge by several hundred men who seemed to have materialised out of the smoke and chaos. That shock, that sudden reversal, broke German morale at the precise moment when British morale was already broken. The charge also validated something the British Army had believed for centuries, that British infantry, properly led and motivated, could close with any enemy and win. Gheluvelt was decided by bayonets and determination, not by firepower or numbers. The Worcesters achieved victory through traditional infantry virtues: courage, discipline, aggression at the critical moment. In an industrial war dominated by artillery and machine guns, one of the most decisive moments came down to men with fixed bayonets charging across open ground. It was almost medieval. It was certainly desperate. But it worked. For the Worcestershire Regiment, Gheluvelt became their defining moment. The battle they'd talk about for generations, the day when their forebears saved an army. Gheluvelt Day, October 31st, was commemorated by the regiment every year. Veterans would gather to remember the men who charged the chateau grounds, to honour Major Hankey and the 187 soldiers who died, and to tell younger soldiers about the standard their predecessors had set. The human cost of Gheluvelt was staggering. 187 men killed or wounded in 30 minutes. Families across Worcestershire received the telegram they'd dreaded since August. Sons, husbands, fathers who'd survived 3 months of fighting died taking a chateau most Britons had never heard of. The survivors carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives, but they'd achieved something worth the cost. They'd saved not just an army, but potentially a nation's ability to continue fighting. Those 187 casualties prevented tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of future casualties by keeping Britain in the war at a critical moment. The First Battle of Ypres ended in late November 1914. Both sides had fought themselves to exhaustion. The Germans had failed to break through despite massive superiority in numbers. The British had held despite catastrophic casualties. The old contemptibles, the professional army Britain had sent to war in August, had been virtually destroyed. Of the 100,000 men who'd crossed to France in August, perhaps 30,000 remained effective by December. But they'd achieved their mission. They'd held the line until the Empire's resources could be mobilised. They'd bought the time Britain needed to raise the mass armies that would fight for the next 4 years. Gheluvelt stands as one of the crucial moments in that desperate first battle for Ypres. October 31st was the day the German breakthrough came closest to success. It was the moment when everything hung by a thread, and 364 men of the Worcesters were the thread that held. One battalion counterattacking at exactly the right place at exactly the right time, achieving exactly what was needed through courage, discipline, and bayonets. Today, the chateau at Gheluvelt still stands, rebuilt after the war, now a private residence. The Ypres salient is peaceful farmland, though ploughs still turn up shells and bones from the battles fought there. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission maintains cemeteries across the area, each containing thousands of British and Empire soldiers who died defending that small corner of Belgium. Gheluvelt itself is a quiet village, unremarkable except for the memorial that marks where the Worcesters launched their charge. But in October 1914, Gheluvelt was the hinge on which the war turned. The place where British professional soldiers demonstrated what training, discipline and courage could achieve against impossible odds. The moment when 364 men charged into certain death because their orders said charge, and by charging they saved an army, a position, and possibly a war. It was the British Army at its finest, not through clever tactics or overwhelming firepower, but through simple, bloody-minded refusal to give up, even when giving up seemed the only rational choice. If this is the kind of history that matters to you, the battles where everything hung in the balance, the moments when small groups of men changed the course of nations, the days when British courage and discipline proved stronger than any enemy, then you know what to do. These stories deserve to be remembered. Thank you for watching Britain's history. The battles that shaped a nation, told the way they deserve to be told.